The crystal chandelier of the St. James Hotel cast a warm, flawless glow over Riley's modest engagement ring, a symbol of the quiet, safe life she had painstakingly rebuilt from nothing. But as the new majority shareholder stepped to the podium, the champagne glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor. It was Oliver, the husband she had betrayed 5 years ago, the man who had left her with empty bank accounts, and he was staring directly at her with a smile that promised absolute ruin. If you are drawn to stories where the past refuses to stay buried and every secret demands a devastating price, stay with me. The grand ballroom of the St. James Hotel smelled of white lilies and expensive champagne. It was the scent of success of high society Chicago. And for Riley Campbell, it was the scent of survival. She stood near the velvet-draped entrance, adjusting the subtle earpiece tucked behind her sleek dark hair. 5 years ago, she had been a pariah, a woman drowning in debt with a scandal attached to her name, left entirely bankrupt by a husband she had deeply, unforgivably wronged. Tonight, she was the director of events, wearing a tailored navy dress that bespoke quiet authority, a modest diamond engagement ring from a good, safe man resting on her left hand. She had crawled out of the abyss, clawing her way back to respectability, one grueling shift at a time. "Stop hovering, Campbell," a voice murmured beside her ear. Brittany Cole, the hotel's PR manager, handed Riley a glass of sparkling water. Brittany's eyes swept over the crowded room of socialites and investors. "The floral arrangements are perfect. The lighting is perfect. You're perfect. The new overlord will be impressed." Riley managed a tight smile, accepting the water. The new overlord just bought out the entire St. James portfolio in cash. Brit. Rumor has it he fired the Chicago general manager before his jet even landed at O'Hare. "I'd rather hover." "Fair," Brittany conceded, tapping her manicured nails against her tablet. "They say he's ruthless. Built an empire in London out of nowhere. No one even has a recent photo of him." Riley let the chatter wash over her, her gaze tracking the waitstaff. She didn't care about ruthless billionaires. She had survived Charles Anderson's cowardice. She had survived the freezing nights in a studio apartment with no heat after her bank accounts were legally drained. She had survived the devastating silence of a husband walking out the door and never looking back. Corporate takeovers were nothing. A sudden shift in the room's atmosphere pulled her attention. The low hum of networking silenced, rippling outward from the double mahogany doors. "Oh," Brittany breathed out, her posture straightening. "There he is." Riley turned. The man entering the ballroom was flanked by a severe-looking executive team, but he commanded the space with a terrifying stillness. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over a frame that was broader, harder than she remembered. His hair was styled with meticulous precision, touched with a faint dusting of silver at the temples. But the eyes, those cold, calculating, slate-gray eyes, were exactly the same. The glass of water slipped from Riley's hand. It hit the thick carpet with a muted thud, splashing over her polished heels, but she didn't look down. She couldn't breathe. The air in the ballroom had suddenly turned to ash in her lungs. Oliver, her ex-husband, the man whose heart she had broken, whose pride she had shredded in the backseat of Charles Anderson's car. The man who had taken every cent they owned and disappeared into thin air, leaving her to face the brutal consequences of her infidelity alone. He was here. Oliver stopped near the center of the room. He didn't look at the extravagant ice sculptures or the wealthy investors clamoring for his attention. His gaze cut through the crowd, deliberate and unerring, until it locked directly onto Riley. Time fractured. The 5 years of grueling work, the therapy, the safe new fiancé, the carefully constructed walls of her new life, they all felt like paper houses under the weight of his stare. Oliver didn't glare. He didn't look angry. Instead, the corner of his mouth tilted up in a microscopic, chilling smile. It was the look of a predator who had finally cornered its prey after years of patiently waiting in the dark. He gave her a single slow nod of acknowledgement, then turned his back to her greeting and investor. Beside her, Brittany frowned, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shattered Riley's world. "Did you know him?" "He was looking right at you." Riley's hands trembled violently as she pressed them against her stomach, the cold sweat prickling her spine. She had spent 5 years believing she had finally paid for her sins. Looking at the new owner of the St. James Hotel, Riley realized with horrifying clarity that her punishment had only just begun. The private elevator to the St. James penthouse moved with a terrifying, frictionless silence. Riley watched the digital numbers climb 40, 41, 42, each chime feeling like a physical blow to her chest. She clutched the leather binder holding her event schedule so tightly her knuckles were white. At 8 a.m., an icy email from executive management had bypassed her direct supervisor. Mr. Hartwell requires a comprehensive briefing from the director of events. Penthouse suite, 9 a.m. sharp. The brass doors slid open. Riley stepped onto the thick slate gray carpet of the penthouse foyer. The air up here was different, thinner, smelling faintly of black coffee and cedarwood, a scent so familiar it made her stomach hollow out. Ms. Campbell. The voice came from the expansive living area. Oliver was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows staring out at the sprawling steel and glass grid of downtown Chicago. He wore a crisp white shirt, no tie, the cuffs rolled back to expose his forearms. He didn't turn around when she walked in. "Mr. Hartwell," Riley said. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of the confident authority she usually commanded. He finally turned, taking a slow sip from a porcelain cup. The morning light caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting lines that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He moved toward the massive marble dining table, gesturing for her to sit. "I prefer to understand the lifeblood of my acquisitions immediately." Oliver said, his tone entirely conversational, entirely professional. "St. James relies heavily on its corporate gala revenue. Walk me through the Q3 projections." He was not going to mention the past. He was not going to mention the night he found the text messages from Charles on her unlocked phone. He was going to sit across from her, breathing the same air, and dismantle her professionally. It was a calculated, devastating cruelty. Riley opened her binder, her hands shaking so badly she had to press them flat against the marble. "Our Q3 projections show a 12% increase, largely driven by the upcoming tech summits and—" She spoke for 10 minutes. Oliver didn't interrupt. He simply watched her. His slate gray eyes tracked the nervous swallows in her throat, the way she avoided looking directly at him, the modest diamond ring catching the light on her left hand. When his gaze landed on the ring, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Passable," Oliver finally interrupted, closing the portfolio she had spent all night preparing. "But uninspired. You play it very safe now, don't you, Miss Campbell? No risks." The double meaning hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Riley swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I find that stability yields the best long-term results for the hotel." "Stability is an illusion," Oliver replied softly, leaning back in his chair. "It can be shattered in a single evening. I am restructuring the reporting hierarchy, effective immediately." Riley's breath caught. "Sir, given the revenue weight of your department, the director of events will no longer report to the general manager." Oliver stood up, walking slowly around the table until he was standing just behind her chair. Riley froze, every nerve ending screaming at the proximity. She could feel the heat radiating from him. "You will report directly to me," his voice dropped, a quiet murmur near her ear. "Every contract, every vendor, every hour of your schedule. You will bring it to this penthouse and you will explain it to me." Riley closed her eyes, the sheer magnitude of the trap snapping shut around her. She couldn't quit. She was one missed paycheck away from the financial terror he had just escaped. He knew that. He had the complete financial dossiers of all his employees. "Understood," she whispered to the empty air in front of her. "Good," Oliver said, stepping away. "You are dismissed, Riley." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded like a death sentence. The basement office of the St. James Hotel was windowless and perpetually chilled, a stark contrast to the sprawling penthouse 40 floors above. Riley sat at her desk, the glow of her dual monitors casting harsh blue shadows across her face. She was supposed to be reviewing the catering invoices for the upcoming pharmaceutical summit, but the numbers blurred into meaningless gray lines. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in Chicago 5 years ago. It was terrifying how easily a life could be dismantled. Back then, her marriage to Oliver had felt like a quiet, stagnant pond. He was a man consumed by his early career in finance, methodical, quiet, and consistently absent. In her foolishness, Riley had mistaken his steadfast reliability for indifference. She had mistaken peace for boredom. Then came Charles Anderson, a charismatic VP of marketing at her former firm. Charles had offered the illusion of fire. Stolen glances in the break room, lingering touches in the elevator, late-night text messages. that felt like dangerous electricity. The affair had been a pathetic cliché descent into selfishness. She had traded her integrity for cheap adrenaline. The memory of the night it all collapsed tasted like ash in her mouth. There had been no screaming, no shattered plates, no dramatic confrontations. Riley had returned from a supposed weekend conference in Denver to find their townhouse completely dark. Oliver was sitting in the armchair by the window, his posture unnaturally rigid. On the coffee table lay her iPad, the screen brightly illuminating a string of explicit messages between her and Charles that had synced to the cloud. Oliver hadn't raised his voice. He had simply looked at her with an emptiness that chilled her to the bone. "I trusted you," was all he had said. He stood up, picked up a single duffel bag he had already packed, and walked out the front door. Riley pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, breathing shallowly into the quiet of her hotel office. The true horror had begun the next morning. Oliver's revenge hadn't been physical. It had been surgical. Within 48 hours, she discovered that every joint bank account had been legally drained, the funds transferred to untraceable offshore trusts he had quietly established months prior. The lease on the townhouse, solely in his name, was terminated. Her credit cards were frozen. He evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum of debt and a perfectly orchestrated paper trail that implicated her in severe financial mismanagement at her own job, leading to her swift termination. And Charles. The moment the scandal threatened his pristine corporate image, in his own marriage, he had vanished, blocking her number and denying everything to HR. She was left entirely alone, financially ruined, and socially radioactive. A sharp knock on her office door jolted Riley back to the present. Brittany poked her head in, holding a stack of laminated VIP passes. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Campbell. Are you breathing?" Riley quickly lowered her hands, smoothing her expression into the polite, neutral mask that had taken years to perfect. "Just tired," she lied smoothly. "The new reporting structure is an adjustment." "Well, adjust quickly," Brittany warned, dropping the passes on the desk. "The new overlord's assistant just called down. Mr. Hartwell wants you in the main lobby at 6 tomorrow morning to personally review the floral deliveries. The man doesn't sleep." Riley stared at the passes. He was suffocating her inch by inch, forcing her to live under the constant shadow of the man she had destroyed. And the most agonizing part, the truth she could never admit aloud, was that she knew she deserved it. The lobby of the St. James Hotel was eerily silent at 6 in the morning, save for the faint hum of the revolving doors and the distant, lonely wail of a Chicago police siren. The dawn light filtering through the massive glass atrium was cold and gray, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Riley stood rigidly beside a towering arrangement of white hydrangeas and eucalyptus, holding her breath as Oliver Hartwell inspected a single bruised petal. He didn't wear a suit jacket this early, just a dark tailored waistcoat over a slate dress shirt that perfectly matched the terrifying emptiness of his eyes. "The stems are cut at an improper angle," Oliver noted, his voice barely above a murmur, devoid of any inflection. He dropped the petal onto the polished stone floor. "Who holds the exclusive floral contract for the St. James?" Riley's pulse hammered violently against her ribs. She swallowed the suffocating dryness in her throat. "Tierney Botanical. They have been our primary vendor for 3 years. Their arrangements are the cornerstone of our luxury gala aesthetic." Oliver turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto hers. He knew. Of course he knew. He had not acquired a multi-million-dollar hospitality portfolio without conducting a forensic audit of every dime spent. He knew perfectly well that Tierney Botanical was owned by Mark Tierney, the kind, painfully steady man whose modest diamond currently rested on Riley's left ring finger. Mark, who woke up at 4 in the morning to source local orchids, who had offered Riley a quiet, unassuming life when she was drowning in the wreckage of her own making. 3 years, Oliver repeated softly, pulling a sleek silver pen from his pocket. He tapped it rhythmically against the edge of his leather-bound tablet. "Their profit margins are bloated. The delivery logistics are entirely inefficient for a property of this scale. We are a business, Ms. Campbell, not a charity for mediocre local artisans." "Their quality is unmatched, Mr. Hartwell," Riley countered, forcing her voice to remain professionally detached, though her fingernails bit sharply into her palms. "Switching to a corporate wholesaler would compromise the bespoke experience our high-tier clients expect. It would damage the brand." Oliver closed the physical distance between them with one deliberate step. The familiar, agonizing scent of his cedarwood cologne wrapped around her. Loyalty is an expensive luxury, Ms. Campbell. In my experience, it rarely pays off. The double meaning hung in the freezing air between them, sharp and jagged as broken glass. Riley couldn't look away from the hollow darkness in his eyes. If Oliver terminated the St. James contract, Mark's small business would collapse instantly. He had taken out a massive second mortgage to expand his greenhouse operations, specifically to meet the hotel's overwhelming demands. Oliver wasn't just threatening a vendor, he was threatening to systematically dismantle the safe, predictable man Riley had chosen to hide behind. "I will personally oversee their next delivery." Riley said the words slipping out in a hurried, breathless rush. Her eyes pleaded in a way her voice couldn't. "I will ensure the margins are renegotiated to your absolute satisfaction." Oliver stared at her, absorbing the quiet, pathetic desperation in her posture. He was studying her, calculating the exact breaking point of her composure. He let the silence stretch out until the awakening city outside seemed to fade away entirely, leaving her trapped in the vacuum of his judgment. "You will have a revised proposal on my desk by tomorrow evening," Oliver finally said, turning his back to her and walking toward the private elevators. "If it does not meet my standards, Tierney Botanical is finished, and so is whoever relies on it." Riley stood completely alone in the cavernous lobby, staring down at the crushed hydrangea petal near the toe of her shoe. She pressed a trembling hand over her engagement ring, the cold metal offering absolutely no comfort. The past wasn't just haunting her anymore. It had officially declared war on the innocent. The St. James Mezzanine was a symphony of orchestrated chaos. The annual Global Tech Innovation Summit had descended upon Chicago, bringing with it 500 delegates, endless lanyards, and a low, persistent hum of corporate networking. Riley stood behind the polished mahogany registration desk, her posture rigid, masking the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones over the past week. She handed a welcome packet to a venture capitalist, her professional smile completely disconnected from the deadness behind her eyes. Renegotiating Mark's floral contract to appease Oliver's sadistic shifting standards had taken a toll she couldn't quantify. She felt hollowed out, surviving minute by minute. "Ms. Campbell, we have a slight issue with the VIP suite allocations," a junior concierge whispered nervously, stepping up beside her. Riley turned to address the girl, but her gaze snagged on a figure moving through the revolving brass doors. The air vanished from her lungs. He wore a tailored Italian suit that was slightly too flashy for the morning hour. His hair was impeccably styled, framing a handsome face that was undeniably older, yet entirely unchanged in its arrogant ease. He moved through the crowd with the entitled stride of a man who believed the world existed solely to accommodate his desires. Charles Anderson. Riley gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, her fingernails digging into the wood until the sharp pain grounded her. Nausea, bitter and acidic, clawed up her throat. 5 years. 5 years since he had cowardly blocked her number, sacrificed her to save his own marriage, and left her to face Oliver's absolute financial destruction alone. And here he was, standing in the lobby of the hotel she had spent half a decade bleeding for. He approached the VIP registration lane, laughing into his cell phone before slipping it into his jacket pocket. As he reached the desk, his eyes casually swept over the staff. They landed on Riley. For a fraction of a second, shock registered on his face. The easy, confident smile faltered. Then, with the practiced sociopathy that made him such a successful executive, his expression smoothed into one of amused familiarity. "Well, isn't this a small world?" Charles said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that made Riley's skin crawl. "Riley, it's been a long time. Director of events now. A bit of a step down from your old firm, isn't it?" The sheer audacity of his tone, the lack of guilt, the casual dismissal of the ruins he had helped create paralyzed her. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at the man who had been the catalyst for her total undoing. "Mr. Anderson." Riley finally managed her voice a hollow rasp. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the summit lanyard resting against his silk tie. "Your room key is in the envelope." Charles leaned closer, resting his forearms on the desk, crossing a boundary he had no right to breach. "You look tense, Ree. Still holding a grudge after all these years. We were young. Mistakes happen." Mistakes, the word echoed in her mind. Her destroyed marriage, her empty bank accounts, the terrifying emptiness in Oliver's eyes the night he left. all condensed into a casual, flippant mistake. Before she could find the breath to reply, a cold prickle of awareness washed over the back of her neck. It was a visceral, instinctual warning. Riley slowly looked past Charles, lifting her gaze to the glass-paneled interior balcony of the second floor. Standing perfectly still in the shadows looking down at the registration desk was Oliver. He wasn't moving, he wasn't reviewing documents. He was simply watching the two of them, the wife who had betrayed him and the man she had chosen. The expression on his face was unreadable, a terrifying blankness that promised absolute devastation. He hadn't just allowed Charles to book a room for the summit. He had known. He had orchestrated this collision. Charles followed her gaze, oblivious to the invisible tripwire he had just walked through. "Who's the guy in the suit?" "The owner," Riley whispered, feeling the last remaining fragments of her safe life begin to fracture. "He's the owner." The service hallway behind the main banquet kitchens was a stark fluorescent-lit concrete tunnel that smelled faintly of industrial bleach. It was the only place in the St. James Hotel where a person could hide from the endless surveillance of polished mirrors and security cameras. Riley stood with her forehead pressed against the cool steel of a service elevator door, her eyes squeezed shut, trying to regulate the panicked, shallow rhythm of her breathing. She had barely survived the morning. The image of Oliver looking down from the balcony, a silent orchestrator of her torment, was burned into the back of her eyelids. The heavy fire door at the end of the hallway clicked shut. Riley turned instantly, pasting on her professional mask, but it slipped the moment she saw Brittany Cole walking toward her. The PR manager's usually perfectly composed face was tight, her dark eyes flashing with a mix of disbelief and sharp protective anger. She held her tablet tightly against her chest. "I lock the doors when there's a crisis," Brittany said, her voice echoing slightly in the narrow corridor. She didn't stop until she was standing inches from Riley. "And right now, Campbell, you are a walking, unmitigated PR disaster." Riley swallowed the lump of ash in her throat. "Britt, I don't have time right now. The tech summit—" "I saw the registration desk." Brittany interrupted, her tone flat and uncompromising. "I saw Charles Anderson practically undress you with his ego. And more importantly, I saw our new overlord watching the two of you like he was calculating the exact velocity needed to drop you both off the roof." Riley flinched, stepping back. Her shoulders hit the steel elevator doors. Brittany unlocked her tablet, the screen casting a harsh white glare onto her face. "I am very good at my job, Riley. When the atmosphere in my lobby turns toxic, I find out why. I ran a deep archive search. It took me 3 hours to bypass the scrubbed records, but I found the old Chicago financial filings." She turned the screen around. It was a scanned copy of a bleak legal notice from 5 years ago, a declaration of total bankruptcy, and right above it, a dissolution of marriage certificate. Petitioner Oliver Hartwell. Respondent Riley Campbell. The air in the hallway evaporated. Riley stared at her own name in coal black print, the letters blurring together as a profound, paralyzing shame washed over her. Her hands fell limply to her sides. There was nowhere left to run. "You were married to him," Brittany whispered, the anger draining from her voice, replaced by a horrifying realization. "The billionaire currently torturing you with vendor contracts and impossible demands. He's your ex-husband, and he left you with absolute zero." Riley closed her eyes. A single tear, hot and humiliating, traced the curve of her cheek. "He didn't just leave me with zero, Britt. He erased me. He legally and methodically burned my life to the ground." Brittany lowered the tablet. She stared at the broken woman in front of her, connecting the final devastating piece of the puzzle. And Charles Anderson. Where does he fit into this wreckage? The silence that stretched between them was heavier than concrete. Riley opened her eyes, looking directly at the flickering fluorescent light overhead, but unable to meet her friend's gaze. "Charles is the man I destroyed my marriage for," Riley said, her voice completely hollow, stripped of all defense. "Oliver isn't here to run a hotel, Britt. He's here to finish the job." Brittany stared at her, the tablet slipping slightly in her grip. For the first time since Riley had known her, the PR manager had absolutely no words to spin the narrative. The truth was too ugly, and the trap Oliver had built around them was already locked. The rain hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. Riley stood in front of Oliver's massive mahogany desk, her damp coat draped over her arm. She carefully placed the revised proposal for Tierney Botanical on the polished wood. She had spent the entire night agonizing over the margins, slashing Mark's profits to the bone just to meet the impossible metric Oliver had set. Oliver did not look at the folder. He was staring at his laptop screen, the pale light illuminating the sharp, unyielding lines of his jaw. "The numbers are adjusted, Mr. Hartwell," Riley said, her voice tight but steady. "The floral contract is now operating at a significant discount for the property." Oliver reached out and placed his hand flat over the manila folder, still not opening it. "We will revisit your fiancé's livelihood later. We have a more pressing operational failure to discuss." Riley's stomach plummeted. She gripped the fabric of her coat. "The tech summit is running precisely on schedule." "The generous sessions, perhaps," Oliver replied, finally turning his slate-gray eyes toward her. "But I have just received a complaint from our most prominent guest. Mr. Anderson feels his VIP delegation is not receiving the bespoke attention the St. James brand promises. He is hosting a private closed-door dinner in the Astor Suite at 8 o'clock tonight." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Riley stared at him, the horrifying realization of what he was doing slowly paralyzing her vocal cords. "I have already assigned our senior banquet captain to the Astor Suite." She managed to say the words scraping against her throat. "The service will be flawless." "A banquet captain is insufficient for an investor of Mr. Anderson's caliber," Oliver said, leaning back in his leather chair. The predatory stillness returned to his posture. "I expect the director of events to personally coordinate the room. You will be present for the duration of the dinner. You will pour the wine. You will ensure Mr. Anderson's every need is anticipated and met." It was a brilliant, sick piece of psychological torture. Oliver wasn't just firing her. He was forcing her to serve the man she had destroyed her marriage for, reducing her to a silent waitress in the shadows of Charles's arrogance. He wanted to watch her strip away her own pride piece by piece. "Oliver, please." The name slipped out before she could stop it, a desperate, pathetic fracture in her corporate armor. His eyes darkened instantly, a flash of raw, terrifying anger piercing through his cold facade. "You do not have the privilege of using my given name, Ms. Campbell. We are not married. We are not equals." Riley flinched as if she had been struck. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. "You have a choice," Oliver continued, his voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur. "You may oversee the dinner and prove your absolute dedication to this hotel. Or if serving Mr. Anderson is too great an insult to your fragile sensibilities, you may leave your key card on this desk. I will accept your immediate resignation, and I will shred the botanical contract before you even reach the ground floor." He was looking at her with a profound emptiness, waiting for the break. He wanted her to shatter. He wanted her to beg. Riley looked at the folder under his hand, the manifestation of Mark's trust, his home, his safety. She swallowed the suffocating bile of her own shame. She had forfeited her right to pride 5 years ago in the back seat of Charles's car. "I will be in the Astor Suite at 8, Riley whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I will oversee the service." "I thought you might," Oliver said quietly. He dismissed her with a slight wave of his hand, turning back to his screen. "Ensure the vintage is exactly to his liking. We both know how particular his tastes are." Riley turned and walked toward the heavy brass doors, moving like a ghost. She had survived the bankruptcy. She had survived the isolation. But as she stepped into the elevator, she realized Oliver was going to make sure she did not survive the memory. The Astor Suite dinner was a 3-hour marathon of psychological waterboarding. Riley poured the Bordeaux, refilled the crystal water glasses, and stood silently in the periphery while Charles laughed, boasted, and occasionally threw a mocking, triumphant glance her way. By the time the final guest departed at midnight, Riley felt entirely hollowed out, scraped clean of whatever dignity she had managed to claw back over the past 5 years. She didn't go down to the locker room to change out of her uniform. She didn't call Mark, who was surely asleep in his quiet suburban house, oblivious to the nightmare she was living. She got into the private elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. Oliver's office was dark, illuminated only by the amber glow of a single desk lamp and the sprawling grid of Chicago's midnight lights outside the massive windows. He was sitting in the shadows, a heavy crystal tumbler in his hand, his tie discarded and his collar unbuttoned. He looked up as she walked in the heavy oak doors, closing with a definitive thud behind her. Riley walked straight to his desk and dropped the silver corkscrew onto the polished wood. The metal clattered loudly, a sharp, abrasive sound in the silent room. "I poured the wine," she said, her voice shaking with an exhaustion that went straight to the bone. I smiled. I stood in the corner like a piece of furniture while the man who helped me burn our marriage down paraded his ego around the room. "Is this it? Am I bled dry yet?" Oliver set his glass down slowly. The cold, calculating CEO mask he had worn since his arrival seemed to fracture in the dim light. He stood up, rounding the desk, his movements tight, constrained by a sudden volatile tension. "You smell like him," Oliver said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, jagged whisper. It wasn't an observation. It was a visceral accusation. "You smell like his cigars." Riley didn't retreat. The sheer agony of the evening had burned away her fear, leaving only a desperate, reckless need for the truth. "Because you put me in that room with him. You orchestrated this. You want to punish me. Fine. You took the money. You took my career. You took my reputation. But this isn't justice, Oliver. This is sickness." Oliver closed the distance between them so fast Riley gasped. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical weight, suffocating in its intensity. He trapped her against the edge of the desk, leaning in until she could see the faint pulse beating erratically in his jaw. "Sickness," he breathed, the words saturated with a raw, unhealed agony that finally bled through his icy exterior. "You think you understand sickness? You went to his bed while I was planning a future for us. You let him dismantle me in my own home, and you expect to just build a quiet little life with a greenhouse owner and pretend I don't exist." Riley's breath caught in her throat. The anger in his eyes wasn't cold anymore. It was a raging, suffocating fire. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears finally broke free, slipping down her pale cheeks. "I was horribly, unforgivably wrong. But keeping me here, forcing me to bleed out in front of you every single day, it's not fixing you, Oliver. You're just bleeding with me." For a terrifying, endless second, Oliver's gaze dropped to her trembling lips. The hatred in his eyes warred violently with something darker, something agonizingly unresolved. The space between them crackled with the heavy, toxic gravity of a love that had violently decomposed into obsession. He abruptly stepped back, turning his face away toward the window, as if the sight of her tears physically burned him. His breathing was heavy, uneven in the quiet room. "Get out," he commanded, his voice stripped of all its former absolute power, sounding dangerously hollow. "Get out before I take the rest of it." Riley fled the office, the silence of the penthouse echoing louder than any scream. The executive lounge was supposed to be empty during the keynote address. Riley had retreated there simply to breathe, pressing a cold glass of water to her temple. The headache behind her eyes had been a relentless throb since she fled Oliver's office the night before. The heavy door clicked shut and the lock engaged. Riley turned. Charles Anderson stood by the entrance, slipping his phone back into his pocket. The arrogant smirk on his face made the cold water in her stomach turn to acid. "You've been avoiding me, Ryan," Charles said, walking slowly toward the leather sofa where she stood. "I thought we bonded over the vintage Bordeaux last night." "The door needs to remain unlocked, Mr. Anderson," Riley said, her voice strictly professional, though her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her throat. "If you need assistance—" "I need a favor," Charles interrupted, invading her personal space. He pulled his phone back out, tapping the screen before holding it up. "My board is demanding budget cuts. I need the St. James to comp our annual summit for the next 3 years. You're going to push the paperwork through." Riley stared at him in disbelief. "I don't have the authority to authorize a multi-million-dollar write-off. And even if I did, I wouldn't." Charles sighed a patronizing sound. He angled the screen toward her. Riley's breath seized. It was a photo from 5 years ago, intimate, explicit, taken in the chaotic sheets of a hotel room they used to rent. "Cloud backups are a wonderful thing," Charles murmured, his eyes dropping to the modest diamond on her left hand. "I did a little digging on you, Riley. Mark Tierney, right nice guy, sells flowers. I wonder how his modest, conservative little heart would handle an email containing an entire gallery of what his future wife likes to do behind closed doors." The threat was a physical blow. The room spun slightly. She was going to lose Mark. She was going to lose the last shred of peace she had clawed out of the dirt. Before she could speak, the mahogany paneled door of the adjoining private meeting room swung open. Oliver walked. He moved with a terrifying predatory silence, his slate gray suit immaculately pressed. He didn't look angry. He looked like an executioner who had just been handed a signed warrant. Charles instantly straightened his phone, disappearing into his jacket. His arrogant demeanor shifted into a slick, sycophantic smile. "Mr. Hartwell, I didn't realize you were in there. I was just discussing some contract renegotiations with your director of events." Oliver stopped a few feet away. He looked at Charles with the kind of clinical disgust one might reserve for a cockroach. "My name is Oliver Hartwell," he said, his voice quiet, echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "5 years ago, you slept with my wife. Did you truly believe I would let you walk into my hotel without consequence?" The color drained from Charles's face in an instant. The slick smile vanished, replaced by a profound, dawning terror. He looked from Oliver to Riley, the devastating realization finally connecting. "Mr. Hartwell, Charles stammered, taking a step back. It was a mistake. I didn't know." Oliver didn't blink. He pulled a folded legal document from the inside pocket of his jacket and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, I finalized the hostile acquisition of your parent company," Oliver stated smoothly. "You are terminated effective immediately. The morality clause in your contract has been triggered by the extensive embezzlement my forensic accountants uncovered in your offshore accounts overnight. Your wife has been notified. Your assets are frozen. You have 10 minutes to vacate my property before security escorts you out in handcuffs." Charles stared at the paper, his chest heaving, his entire life disintegrating in the span of 30 seconds. Without another word, he turned and fled the lounge, leaving the door wide open. Riley stood frozen, trembling violently. She looked at Oliver, expecting to see a white knight, but the emptiness in his eyes had only grown colder. Oliver stepped closer, his gaze dropping to the trembling hand she held against her chest. "He thought he could break you," Oliver whispered, the quiet possessiveness in his tone more terrifying than any threat. "He forgot that you are already broken, and you belong to me." The modest diamond ring felt unnaturally heavy, like a lead weight designed to drag her to the bottom of the ocean. Riley sat on the edge of her unmade bed in her cramped apartment, the relentless Chicago rain blurring the streetlights outside her window into smeared streaks of yellow and red. The phone call with Mark had lasted less than 10 minutes. There had been no screaming, no dramatic accusations, only his profound, quiet confusion as she methodically tore down the safe future they had planned. She hadn't given him the grotesque details of Charles Anderson or the terrifying reality of Oliver Hartwell. She had simply told him the one truth she could no longer deny: she was a woman built on a foundation of rot, and she refused to let his life sink into it. When she slid the ring off her finger and placed it on the nightstand, the phantom chill on her skin felt like a death sentence. But it was also, for the first time in 5 years, the absolute truth. An hour later, Riley stood in the private elevator of the St. James Hotel, her coat soaked through from the walk. She had bypassed the lobby using her master's security clearance to access the penthouse floor. She had nothing left to lose, no career to protect, no fiancé to shield. The brass doors parted with a soft chime. The penthouse was shrouded in darkness, save for the ambient glow of the city filtering through the glass walls. Oliver was seated on the low minimalist sofa, staring out at the skyline. He didn't turn when she walked in, though the subtle tightening of his shoulders told her he knew exactly who it was. Riley walked slowly across the slate carpet, the silence pressing against her eardrums. She stopped a few feet away from him. "I left him," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, completely devoid of the defensive edge she had wielded for weeks. It was the flat, hollow sound of absolute defeat. Oliver finally turned his head. His eyes dropped to her left hand, registering the pale, empty band of skin on her ring finger. For a fraction of a second, something sharp and complicated flickered in his slate gray eyes, but his expression remained a mask of flawless marble. "Did you expect a congratulation?" he asked, his tone dangerously quiet. "I expect nothing," Riley replied, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself. "You told me I belonged to you because I was broken. You were right. I spent 5 years thinking that if I just worked hard enough, If I found someone safe enough, I could outrun what I did to you in that townhouse." She took a shaky breath, the tears she had held back all evening finally spilling over hot and silent. "But you can't outrun a ghost," she continued, her voice cracking. "I destroyed a good man today because I finally realized I have no right to his peace. I destroyed you 5 years ago for absolutely nothing. I traded my soul for cheap adrenaline, and I have hated myself every single second since." Everything. Oliver stood up slowly. The space between them crackled with the heavy toxic gravity of their shared ruin. He stepped closer, towering over her, searching her face for the lie, the manipulation, the excuse. He found nothing but a devastating, bottomless sorrow. "I am so sorry, Oliver," Riley whispered, closing her eyes as the agonizing weight of her confession finally left her lungs. "I know it doesn't fix the damage. I know you will never forgive me. But I can't play this game anymore. You win. You took it all. There is nothing left to break." Oliver stared down at the tears tracking through the rain on her cheeks. His jaw worked tight, the muscles corded with a sudden violent tension. He had spent half a decade planning for this exact moment, the moment she shattered completely at his feet. But as he looked at the empty space on her ring finger and the total surrender in her eyes, the victory tasted entirely like ash. The silence in the penthouse stretched thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the reinforced glass. Oliver stood entirely motionless, staring down at the woman who had haunted every waking hour of his last 5 years. Riley's shoulders were slumped, her head bowed in absolute defeat. The pale band of untouched skin on her left ring finger screamed into the quiet room. She had done exactly what he had engineered her to do. She had ripped apart the safe, predictable harbor she had built, severed her ties to an innocent man, and crawled back into the wreckage of their past to offer him her bare neck. This was the apex of his design, the total unmitigated ruin of Riley Campbell. Oliver waited for the vindication. He waited for the rush of triumph, the healing balm that was supposed to wash over the agonizing, jagged wound she had carved into his chest half a decade ago. Nothing came. Instead, a cold, terrifying vacuum expanded in his ribs. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. Watching her shatter did not rebuild the quiet, trusting marriage he had lost. It did not erase the image of Charles Anderson's texts on her screen. Breaking her had not put him back together. It had merely leveled the ground so they could both stand in the ashes. He raised a hand, his fingers hovering inches from the damp, trembling line of her shoulder. For a fleeting, chaotic second, the instinct to pull her against his chest to comfort the very woman he had just systematically destroyed warred violently with his pride. His hand dropped back to his side, the motion heavy and defeated. "I spent thousands of hours imagining this," Oliver said. His voice was no longer the sharp, commanding weapon of a billionaire CEO. It was a hollow, exhausted rasp. "I bought this property. I spent millions of dollars. I watched you bleed yourself dry, trying to protect a life you knew you didn't deserve. All for this exact moment." Riley slowly lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed and empty. And Bud, Oliver looked away, his gaze drifting to the sprawling, indifferent lights of Chicago far below. The city was moving on, oblivious to the fact that his entire purpose had just evaporated. The vengeance had been a twisted umbilical cord, the only thing keeping him tethered to her all these years. With it gone, there was nothing left but a vast, suffocating isolation. "And it changes absolutely nothing," he whispered. The admission hung in the air, a mutual death sentence. They were no longer predator and prey. They were simply two profoundly broken people standing in a multi-million-dollar tomb of their own making. "Go home, Riley," Oliver said, the words slipping out with a quiet, devastating finality. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. "Your debt is paid. The contract is dissolved. I won't contact you again." Riley didn't argue. She didn't offer another apology. She understood the terrible gravity of what he was saying. The war was over. They had both lost. She turned and walked toward the elevator, her wet shoes making soft dragging sounds against the slate carpet. When the brass doors finally chimed shut, taking her away, the silence of the penthouse rushed back in to claim him. Oliver walked over to his desk, poured a glass of scotch with a remarkably steady hand, and drank to his victory. It tasted exactly like nothing. The cardboard box sitting on Riley's desk was pathetically light. 5 years of grueling shifts, missed holidays, and desperate attempts to prove her worth, all reduced to a handful of pens, a customized coffee mug, and a framed photograph of a dog she used to own. There were no pictures of Mark. She had already thrown those away, unable to bear the physical reminder of the collateral damage she had caused. She placed her St. James Hotel master key card in the center of the bare desk. It landed with a quiet, definitive plastic click. The basement office was entirely silent. Brittany hadn't come down to say goodbye. Riley had emailed her resignation at 3 in the morning, deliberately avoiding a painful farewell. There was nothing left to explain. The ugly truth had burned away all the comforting, safe lies they had shared. Riley picked up the box and walked down the fluorescent-lit corridor for the last time. When she reached the main lobby, the morning rush was in full swing. Bellhops pushed brass carts and guests milled around the registration desk. Riley stopped near the grand entrance, her gaze drifting toward the center console tables. Mark's elaborate, breathtaking arrangements of white hydrangeas and eucalyptus were gone. In their place stood generic corporate-approved vases of stiff lilies. The erasure was total. Oliver had kept his word. He had severed the floral contract, destroying the livelihood of an innocent man simply because Riley had tried to find refuge with him. A fresh wave of agonizing guilt washed over her, but she swallowed it down. She had no right to mourn a life she had forfeited. She pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out onto Michigan Avenue. The biting Chicago wind whipped against her face, smelling of exhaust and freezing rain. She merged into the anonymous flow of commuters, just another broken ghost fading into the city. 40 floors above, Oliver Hartwell sat at the head of the massive mahogany table in the executive penthouse boardroom. His legal team flanked him, sliding stacks of final acquisition documents across the polished wood. "The integration of the St. James portfolio is complete, Mr. Hartwell," his lead counsel said, tapping a silver pen against a ledger. "We've also finalized the termination of the Tierney Botanical contract and processed Ms. Campbell's resignation. The severance was waived per her request." Oliver stared at the gleaming surface of the table. He held his own pen, the ink poised over the final signature line, but his hand was entirely rigid. He had won. The empire was his. The man who had slept with his wife was utterly ruined, facing federal embezzlement charges and public humiliation. The wife who had betrayed him was back on the streets, stripped of her safety, her fiancé, and her career. The scales of justice had been violently, ruthlessly balanced. He signed his name with a swift, aggressive stroke and stood up, ignoring the congratulatory murmurs of his executives. He walked out of the boardroom and down the hall to his private office, shutting the heavy oak doors behind him. The penthouse was immaculate, freezing, and entirely dead. Oliver walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the sprawling grid of the city. Down there, somewhere in that endless maze of concrete and gray skies, was Riley. He would never see her again. The vengeance that had fueled his blood, kept him awake at night, and driven him to build an empire had suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, bottomless cavern in his chest. He pressed his hand against the cold glass, his reflection staring back at him with hollow, unrecognizable eyes. The betrayal had broken his heart 5 years ago, but the revenge had finally cost him his soul. In the end, there was no victory. There were no winners. There was only the rain falling against the glass in the devastating, eternal silence they had left behind.
Thank you.